All right, let's just jump right into a really big, kind of mind-bending problem. For like centuries, some of the smartest people around, theologians, philosophers, they've been stuck on this one thing. They pretty much all agree that God is, by definition, something we can't fully understand. So, if that's true, how in the world can we even talk about God in a way that means anything?
I mean, that's the central question right there, isn't it? It's a total paradox. How do you describe something that's, well, indescribable? How do you use our limited human words for something that's supposed to be beyond all words? It feels like a total dead end. But people have been trying to solve this puzzle forever, and they've come up with some really clever ideas. So we're going to look at three of the biggest attempts to crack this code.
Okay, so our first contender up to bat takes a pretty wild approach. The idea is, instead of even trying to say what God is, we should flip the whole thing on its head. Let's only talk about what God is not. And this has a fancy name, the via negativa, which just means the way of negation. And the logic behind this is actually kind of straightforward when you think about it. Anytime we use a positive word, like, say, God is good or God is powerful, we're squishing this infinite concept into a tiny human box. Our idea of good is so limited, right? So the only way to be truly honest, according to the school of thought, is to just get rid of all those positive labels. God isn't good in the way we think of good. He's something completely beyond that.
And then you've got this one theologian, Pseudo-Dionysius, who took this idea and just ran with it. He basically said that using our brains, using our logic and language to try and figure out God, it actually does the opposite of what we want. It pushes us further away. For him, real connection, real knowledge, only happens when you totally ditch language, when you enter what he called a darkness of unknowing. It's about finding God in the silence, not in the definitions.
But okay, how does this actually work, like in the real world? The philosopher Maimonides came up with a famous example to explain it. Let's say you've never, ever seen a ship, and I want to describe one to you, but I can only use negative words. I'd say, okay, it's not a plant. It's not a mineral. It's not a sphere. It's not flat. Maimonides' point was that if I give you enough of these knots, you'll eventually get almost the right picture. It's like you're carving out a ship-shaped hole in your mind.
Yeah, but here comes the big problem, and it's a huge one. Another philosopher, Brian Davies, lands what's basically a knockout punch. He points out that the whole ship example only works because, we have a pretty good idea of what physical objects can be. But with God, the possibilities are infinite. If I just tell you all the things God is not, what are you left with? Absolutely nothing. Like Davies says, you could just as easily be picturing a wardrobe or a coffin.
Okay, so if the way of negation kind of leads us into an empty room, what's next? Well, that brings us to contender number 2, the way of analogy. And this one, famously championed by the great Thomas Aquinas, really tries to find a sensible middle ground.
So Aquinas starts by saying, look, there are two extreme paths here, and they're both dead ends. First, there's what he calls univocal language. That's where we'd say a word like love means the exact same thing for us as it does for God. That doesn't work, right? Because God is supposed to be infinite. Then there's the other extreme, equivocal language, where love for God means something completely different. That doesn't work either, because then the word is totally meaningless to us. It's just a random sound.
So what's Aquinas' big solution? It's all about analogy. Here's his brilliant insight. Maybe we can't say what God is, but we can say what God is like. He goes back to the idea from Genesis that humans are made in God's image and likeness. So the good qualities we have, love, wisdom, justice, they're like a small, faint echo of the real thing in God. They're not identical, but they're related. They're similar. And he breaks this down into 2 parts, using a memorable example. First, what he calls the analogy of attribution. His example was a bull. He said, if you see that a bull's urine is healthy, you can infer the bull itself is healthy. The health of the urine is caused by and points to the health of the bull. In the same way, our goodness points back to a good creator. The second part is the analogy of proportion. Think about it. A dog can be loyal and a human can be loyal. It's the same quality, but it exists in proportion to their different natures. Well, Aquinas says it's the same with us and God. Our love is like God's love, just, proportionally infinite. But of course, this idea has its critics too. The philosopher Brummer makes a really sharp point. He says, okay, so God's love is proportional to his divine nature, so what?
we don't know what God's divine nature is. It's like me telling you that a Martian's glorp is proportional to its Martian nature. That tells you absolutely nothing about what glorp is. And just like that, Brummer argues, we're right back where we started. Basically, in negative theology, just saying God is not like us. All right, so negation seems too empty. Analogy seems a bit circular. So our third and final contender basically walks in and flips the whole table over. The theologian Paul Tillich says, hey everyone, you're asking the wrong question. He argues that the whole point of religious language isn't to describe God in the first place. For Tillich, all this God talk isn't about making scientific, factual statements. It's not a list of properties. It's symbolic. The whole purpose, he says, isn't to give us information about God, but to create a connection with God. The meaning isn't in the definition of the words, but in what those words do to you spiritually. Now, his big key idea here is a concept called participation, and his go-to example is a national flag. Think about it. A flag isn't just a piece of cloth that's a sign for a country like a stop sign means stop. No, it does more. It participates in the power, the history, the dignity of that nation. It makes you feel something. Tillich says that's exactly how religious symbols work. And he's got this 4-step breakdown of how it works. First, a symbol points to something way beyond itself, to God. Second, it participates in the very thing it's pointing to. Third, in doing that, it unlocks or opens up new levels of spiritual reality for you. And finally, fourth, it opens up parts of your own soul that can then connect with that reality. It's a really powerful idea. It's meant to be a bridge, not a blueprint. But, and you knew there was a but coming, here's the big criticism. The philosopher John Hick steps in and asks a really simple but devastating question. What does participation even mean? It sounds cool, but it's super vague, right? Is it just a strong feeling you get? And does a religious symbol, like a cross, participate in God in the same way a flag participates in a nation? Tillich never gives a clear answer. And that leaves his whole theory wide open to the critique that this is all just psychology, not about something actually real. All right, so there you have it. 3 really brilliant, but maybe also deeply flawed attempts to solve this massive God talk problem. We've had the way of negation, the way of analogy, and the way of symbols. Let's line them all up for a final look. So here's the quick and dirty summary. The way of negation tells us what God is not, but it risks describing, well, nothing at all. The way of analogy tries to tell us what God is like, but the comparison feels a little hollow since we don't know what we're comparing him to. And finally, the way of symbolism says language connects us to God, but that connection might just be a powerful feeling inside our own heads. And in the end, this whole massive debate really comes down to one deep, fundamental question that you have to ask yourself. What is the point of religious language? Is the goal to make true, objective, factual statements about a reality out there? Or is the goal to create a subjective connection, to shape our own inner experience? Each of these theories gives a radically different answer, and it leaves us right there with the big question. What are we really doing when we talk about God?